Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the New Humanitarian and CARE International's online event on the Ukraine effect, driving up costs, driving away attention. My name is Reidy. I'm a staff editor and reporter focusing on migration and special coverage at the New Humanitarian. For a little bit over the past year, special coverage has meant the war in Ukraine. And I'm pleased to be here with you, moderating what promises to be a fascinating conversation. A recording of this event will be shared afterwards, including on our podcast feed. So welcome to our podcast listeners as well. At the start of this year, we held an event on trends to watch that discussed some of the issues that we covered in our annual 10 crises list. One of the entries in our list in January was the title of today's event. So for this conversation, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper. When the war in Ukraine broke out a little more than a year ago, we hosted an online event called Ukraine and Beyond, in which we discussed what media coverage of crises tells us about those we forget. Why do some crises get more attention than others? Is it justified that Western media focus so intensely on Ukraine because it is in Europe, or is it an example of bias, or worse yet, racism? Back then, we were discussing fears about the impact on other crises of sustained media and donor and public attention on the attention-grabbing crises of the time. For Ukraine, it was COVID, and more recently, it has been the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. But now, 1 year on, we wanted to revisit the conversation and see if those fears played out and ask what the impact has been on other crises of the, some might say, disproportionate focus of funding and attention on Ukraine. How are donors prioritizing what to fund when the media spotlight is firmly on Ukraine and recently also Turkey and Syria? But the vast majority of the 230 million people the UN proposes to help with the 51.5 billion it has asked for in 2023 do not live in or around Ukraine. How are humanitarians and governments in countries in desperate need of funds coping and adapting to the current situation? How are families and communities where funds have been cut or never materialized coping? What are frontline humanitarians seeing in countries outside of Ukraine that they think donors need to know about and act on? Joining us for this conversation, we wanted to bring together a cross-section of the aid sector, including voices from donors, humanitarian response, national governments, and civil society, to speak to the challenges faced by responders working on overlooked crises. I'll introduce our speakers shortly. But before we get to that, we wanted to see how everyone is feeling with a quick temperature check. How are you feeling about the year ahead? How are you feeling about the year ahead for a humanitarian response? We asked this question to the audience at our last online event back in January, and there was an overwhelming feeling of uncertainty. So we wanted to see how people are feeling now. Please take a minute to fill in the poll. And while you fill in your answers, a bit of housekeeping for you. First of all, feel free to say hello in the chat and say where you're from and where you work. Feel free also to tweet during the event and tag @NewHumanitarian and @CareGlobal. Subscribe to our daily and weekly newsletter at thenewhumanitarian.org/subscribe. I also want to say thank you to our partner for this event, International. It's been great working with you on this. Thank you to our members and donors who continue to support our mission. Members or readers who donate monthly because they want to see this kind of journalism thrive. You can become a member by visiting thenewhumanitarian.org/membership. And by being a member, you get free access to events like this one. You'll find all the links I've just mentioned and others that will come up in the conversation in the chat. When it comes to asking questions during the event, please use the question and answer function. We may ask you to turn on your mic and ask your question live. So if you've posted a message, keep an eye on your direct messages where our team will give you a heads up if your question is one of the ones selected. Now let's take a look at the poll. Hopefully you've all had a chance to fill in your answers. And when it comes to feeling positive that humanitarians are doing what they can to hold the tide on the tail end of really difficult situations, we have a 0% response, which is pretty shocking. And it looks like the majority of the responses are once again clustered around the uncertain end of the spectrum. But it's also nice to see that some of you out there are cautiously optimistic, and maybe some of that will be reflected in the conversation here today. And certainly feel free to post your thoughts on that in the chat box and have it reflected in the questions that you ask as well. To begin the conversation, I wanted to start by asking our speakers who are working in countries dealing with their own ongoing crises what the last year has been like. We are waiting for Minister Albino Akol Atak, the South Sudanese Minister of Humanitarian Affairs, to join us. So I will start with Mohanna Eljabaly, the General Manager of the Yemen Family Care Association. Mohanna has worked extensively with local NGOs in Yemen on risk compliance, change, and strategic management. The Yemen Family Care Association was last year one of 238 local and international non-governmental organizations that called on leaders at the 77th UN General Assembly to take decisive action to end the spiraling global hunger crisis. Mohanna, to start with you, in Yemen, you've been living through protracted conflict for the past 8 years. Have you seen the effects of donor and media fatigue change over the past year?
Hello, Eric. Hello, everyone. In Yemen, we have been living in a protracted crisis for over 8 years now. And the funding coming to the country has been declining in yearly basis. This was because of some internal and some of the external factors. Internal factors include some of the bureaucratic impediments, access challenges, issues in protection programming in the country, lack of free press, and some of the external factors that I can mention, like donor fatigue. And with other crises on the horizon, we see less political interest in the Yemeni crisis. This has been reflecting to the communities and affected populations negatively. We have seen the funds deteriorating and the services being provided to the affected populations has been declining as well. In Yemen, if we've seen, the numbers are staggering and are shocking. When we talk about Yemen, we're talking about 2 million children out of schools. We are talking about at least 50% of the health facilities are either non-functioning or partially functioning. In a country where there is we're still suffering from a minor marriage problem, this is a huge issue. Also, in a country where the water reserves are depleting, we are seeing around 16 million Yemeni struggling to find access to clean water. All these numbers has built up to the crisis we have seen on the ground today. So yes, the donor fatigue, the issues that we are suffering from are really impacting and hammering the affected communities. And as national NGOs, as international NGOs, the humanitarian spectrum is trying to cope with this. But sometimes it's really difficult that you have to accept some risks. And when we're saying accepting some risks, that means we're seeing numbers are changing drastically. And we really hope that this year will have some kind of a change in the mindset of donor communities, and not just for Yemen actually, but for all the other crises living in the shadows of the permanent crisis. As we have seen today, this event hopefully can highlight some of the struggles that all the countries, not just in Yemen, also in Africa, Asia, and Southern America, can advocate for our crisis, for the issues that we are suffering from, so we could address the most pressing needs on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohanna. A quick follow-up question. The situation that you're explaining is sort of a protracted situation of Yemen being a forgotten or under-focused on crisis. Did you see that situation change at all with the war in Ukraine when it started last year, or has it been sort of a continuum of more or less the same situation?
I can say it might not be the leading factor, the Ukraine war. However, it is certainly an aggravating factor of what we are seeing today in Yemen. Because the conflict has been there for like 8 years, it's normal to be out of the out of the spotlight after a while. But with the Ukraine crisis and also with the earthquake and the shocking earthquake in Turkey and Syria, we have seen recently, the media focus has shifted, and I don't think it will highlight the crisis in such protracted conflict in the same manner as they used to did in the first or second year.
Okay, thank you, Mohanna. And I see that we have been joined by Mr. Albino Akol Atak, who is the South Sudanese Minister of Humanitarian Affairs. Earlier this month, Minister Atak appealed to donors to support his government in tackling South Sudan's own humanitarian crisis. South Sudan needs 1.7 billion to address the humanitarian crises in the country, where more than 9.5 million people are in need. Minister Atak, I know you just joined us, but if I could turn to you for a question. As mentioned, you recently appealed to donors for support. How has the response been to that request, and do you feel like you are getting that support that you need? Sorry, you're still on mute.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much for hosting me and giving me this opportunity to share what is in South Sudan with the rest of your panels that now they are there. It is true, what you mentioned is that before the crisis in Sudan, where South Sudan witnessed now influx of returnees and refugees, we had been actually mobilizing funds to respond to the needs of the people who are actually internally displaced because of issues to do with the impact of climate change that have caused a lot of flooding in our country, as well as drought also in other areas, plus internal conflicts that we always have here, together with the communal fights. All these contributed to a problem and a shortage of almost humanitarian needs for the people of South Sudan. Now, according to our survey or estimation, because we had no proper census since 2008, what we did when we were in one Sudan, because of we have no census, we have now estimated the population of South Sudan to be 12.5 million. Out of these, 9.4 are people to be that are considered to be in need. These people, for us to respond with our partners, of course, the government of South Sudan, having just emerged from war and just, got it independent, we cannot do it alone as the government of South Sudan. So that we are now relying on our partners to help us in this. So together with the partners, we estimated the resources needed for us to respond to these 9.4 million people is 1.7 trillion. But up to now we are in May. But the report we are getting from our partners and all of us, we have not yet reached 1/3 mobilization of these funds simply because of the conflict worldwide, specifically the war in Ukraine. This is what our donors are actually citing. And some donors are actually doing best to contribute in this. So we are still hoping that what we need, we will get it in the course of the year so that we intervene. This is what we have been doing before the crisis in Sudan. Now, when the crisis of Sudan came in and we witnessed this influx of the people, we have another responsibility that we are now shouldering. And the good part of it is that the government of South Sudan have now taken lead to respond to this by identifying the entry points across the border between Sudan and South Sudan to be 12 entry points from the east area called Maban to the west area called Raja. We have about 12 entry points that people are actually entering to the to the territory of the Republic of South Sudan. Majority of them are South Sudanese that have been living in Sudan because of the conflict that we had here. People ran there and they live there. And the statistics shows that 800,000 people from South Sudan have been registered as refugees in Sudan, plus another 300,000 as migrants. And there is 1.5 million people who are living in their own. Some are students, some are workers, some own some properties, because you know that we have been one country. So definitely we have people who have owning some properties. So you can talk about South Sudanese people who have been living in Sudan to be near to 3 million people who are there. Now, with the continuation of this conflict, these people will move to South Sudan. And some of them have already moved to South Sudan, which we have recorded to be more than 50,000 up to now have moved. Most of them coming through the entry point of Joda and Reng and Paluch. So this have added another responsibility to us as the government of South Sudan and the partners that are actually helping us. And we are grateful for their help, of course, but we still need more for us to help each other. Dealing with this influx, to manage this influx, and to continue responding to the needs of the people that I have just mentioned. So the need in our country for humanitarian response is very huge. If you compare it to the level of donation, the level of funding, you can see it is very less. And this is why we came out openly to say we in South Sudan, we need the support of everybody. And we will actually appreciate what everybody is doing. So in short, we can say that the war in Ukraine have affected the operation of humanitarian down here in South Sudan. And this was very clear to the level of response that we as the government and our partners are actually doing to our people. It is also very clear in other aspects, economic aspects in South Sudan. Now we have, there is an increase of the prices of all the commodities that we have. You remember that South Sudan is a landlocked country. We still depend on what we get and what we consume, mostly from outside. And because we have just emerged and a lot of infrastructure, or whatever we're supposed to have been doing, is not yet fully in place. This is why we continue to depend on almost everything that we are importing from outside. So this have actually, with the crisis in Ukraine, has affected us here. If you can see, the prices are up, and the income or whatever we have may not be actually responding to this rise in the prices. And definitely our economic situation now is deteriorating. And if we consider that crisis of Ukraine with its impact on us, plus this crisis of Sudan, that is also going to impact our economy, you can imagine the level of deterioration that we are actually going in terms of economic. And given the fact that South Sudan depends much on Sudan in terms of funding its activities, you can see we will have, a very large impact to come, because South Sudan, for it to fund its activities, depends on oil proceeds much, and the oil is actually passing through Sudan. If we assume that this conflict will continue, and we never know, of course, the behavior of each party of the conflict in Sudan, how they shall behave towards our pipeline, then we can predict that the level of deterioration in economic that we are in now will continue to get worsened. And if it gets worsened, definitely our response ability to humanitarian needs will drop definitely. So this is why with our partners that are here, we are doing our level best to, with the little we have, we respond, but the need is so huge that we need everybody actually to come and help us. In other aspect, of course, political aspect.
Minister Atak, thank you very much for that very comprehensive answer. I'm sorry to have to cut you off, but I want to turn to one of our other speakers for a follow-up question.
Okay.
We are also joined by Sofía Sprechmann Sineiro, the Secretary General of CARE International, our partner for today's event. Sofía told the New Humanitarian recently in an interview that she has been frustrated over the years by what she finds to be a desire to maintain the status quo in the way that humanitarian aid is delivered. Sofía, how have you and CARE been navigating the ways in which you respond to crises that grab everyone's attention? For example, Ukraine, Turkey, the Turkey and Syria earthquakes, compared to crises that still need support, like the ones that Minister Atak was just telling us about in South Sudan, and also that Mohanna was speaking about in Yemen.
Thank you so very much, and it's truly an honor to be part of this panel. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts. It's really a key question, and I think the minister just exemplified it so well. Thank you, Minister Atak, for that, because it's the interconnectedness of the crisis that we really need to signal. So while, of course, there's a lot of attention right now on Ukraine, and that's, of course, a very severe and complex crisis. And we see that everywhere in the news. But I think the trick is to precisely highlight how other parts of the world have had an impact on their extreme hunger due to the war in Ukraine. When we establish those interconnections, then we can also put the spotlight on other countries. So, I mean, it's, of course, we all know this, so, but it's important, of course, to highlight it here again, that the contributions of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation in terms of global production of fuel and agricultural inputs and essential food staples as wheat and maize and sunflowers, of course, enormous. So that if we can highlight how the conflict continues to affect food security indirectly, and particularly on low-income countries and very fragile economies. Of course, it has an impact everywhere in the world, but those still struggling to recover even from the economic impact of COVID have now been kind of doubly charged. So, in fact, it's actually quite shocking that an estimated 1.6 billion people are exposed to at least one dimension of the Ukraine crisis. And about 1.2 billion of those live in a perfect storm country where that also has other impacts of course, climate change and conflict, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean are very badly affected. So when the spotlight is on one part of the world, and when we can then draw the consequences elsewhere and see the kind of the global nature of the issues that we are faced with and how we all are interconnected, then I think we have a chance also to moving the spotlight away to the bigger issues we're facing as a global community. In fact, I mean, it's a shocking fact that over 258 million people, girls, boys, women, men, around the globe are going to bed hungry every night. And it is even more shocking to realize that these people are not starving, but they're being starved. These are, for the most part, people that are fully capable of producing or earning enough food themselves and for their families. They are starved by conflict, by violence, by inequity, by the impacts of climate change, by the loss of land, by jobs, loss of jobs or prospects given the global economic outlook. And and a COVID, of course, let's not forget about that, has left them further behind. So I think it's very important then to understand and try to kind of simply communicate, which is not easy. That's often where we struggle as a humanitarian community, that those drivers of ongoing food insecurity are deeply interconnected. So it's that complex mixture that we need to continue to highlight. And of course, if we on top of it put gender inequality into the mix, and as you all may know, CARE very much focuses on women and girls and gender inequality, that also shouldn't be overlooked, because that's another major contributing driver of course, of food insecurity. So you mentioned earlier the billions of funding that are needed in order to respond, and how we are falling short. And that, by the way, despite of an extraordinary outcome of generosity by donors such as Akol, who and thank you, Michael, for that. But the need is just so overwhelming right now, and of course it's I'm actually very encouraged by the survey that there is still at least 20% or so still had a very positive outlook on, or we're cautiously optimistic, because it is actually very concerning about the immense need that we're seeing all across the world, and the gap there is, despite, of course, the generosity of donors. So yes, putting the spotlight on the interconnectedness, that's probably the main message I would like to leave, so that we can see all of the conflicts, all of the issues, and how we truly are one humanity and depend on each other in order to address the issues of our time.
Thank you for that, Sofía. And a quick follow-up question. In terms of sort of trying to understand this idea of the Ukraine effect, and the war in Ukraine diverting attention and resources from other crises, have you seen that picture change at all in the past year as new crises have emerged in Turkey and Syria with the earthquakes, and now in Sudan with the conflict? And is there something unique about Ukraine, or is what we're seeing sort of the cycle of attention and support that happens as crises move from new to protracted and so on?
Well, I think the uniqueness I just highlighted, which is this, the big impact it has on global food security. But I do think that there have been, spikes of attention on other crises. But I think that what we must insist on is precisely, how something that happens here has a huge effect there, and how that effect can even be harsher and more difficult, let alone, and this is the other area I think that is important to highlight, the increased cost of operations for humanitarian response that is affecting everyone. I mean, WFP monthly operating costs have gone up by 44%. That's true for many NGOs. So, you know, these hard decisions now that we have to make, all NGOs, all humanitarian actors, about cutting rations to reach more people, and taking from the hungry to feed the starving. I mean, this is really what is going on, and this deserves the spotlight. Particularly, this is hugely perverse, if I may add, when you consider that we live in a world where 1/3 of global food is wasted every year. So that is then even more complex, and that also deserves a spotlight. You know, not only the fact that food insecurity has increased, the cost of humanitarian operations has increased, but this deep inequality that we still see around the world, and the fact that so much is wasted in a world that has plenty. I think this also deserves greater spotlight. So the more we can make these interrelationships, and the more we can see that there's the need to globally connect, but if I may also add, to locally lead. And that's another very important message that we constantly attempt to highlight, that our actually mantra as CARE has been that humanitarian response, in order to be effective, must be locally led, and we are there to support and to show global solidarity. But this is really where we want to put the spotlight as well, that the first responders are actually those in the front line of response, and we need to influence to try to ensure that no one is left behind in countries to support this immense need. This is an important message for donors as well, and I'm again very glad to see Michael here, because as he knows, I've been very deeply engaged in donor dialogues around Afghanistan. Forgive me, because there's also fatigue of donors in countries which immense humanitarian need, but it has become more challenging, but not impossible to operate in. And we can be humanitarians also in all of this remarkably creative, despite of the complexity. And it's not easy to convince donors when politics and play a big part in this context. But I think that's another thing that deserves really attention, that despite the challenges, you know, the humanitarian community doesn't go on strike, that there are ways out, there are creative options, especially if they're locally led, to actually have also positive news, because the news cycle is also full of very bad news. There is also the opportunity to actually make a difference if our humanitarian response is locally led.
We're gonna turn to some of these questions about localization a little bit later on in the conversation here. But for now, I'd like to turn to Michael Koehler, who is the Deputy Director General of the European Commission, DG ECHO. Michael spoke recently about the importance of the international community keeping attention on the needs of people, the people in South Sudan. As a major donor, Michael, what are the challenges you face in trying to keep attention on crises like that which are unfolding in South Sudan or Yemen, or any other crisis that has maybe fallen out of the news cycle?
Thank you, Eric, and great to be on this call here with Sofía, Mohanna, with the minister, of course, and so many other good colleagues. You know, I didn't vote when you put out the poll in the beginning, but had I voted, I would probably have been among the 22%, so the moderately optimistic. This is not in order to belittle the problems that we have, but I see there is some progress. The question is, how can we consolidate this progress? How can we make it durable? Now, the question whether Ukraine and the crisis has taken money and attention away from other crises, in my view, cannot yet be answered, to be honest. the impression that we all have is, yes, of course, there's so much public attention going into it that we forget about the rest of the world and the rest of the crisis. I'm not sure the figures really prove that right. I have not yet seen the overall figures for 2022, but if I look at EU figures, I state two or three different items. First, we indeed started a major program for Ukraine and Moldova, and it became the biggest single program that we are financing, but almost everything there, 95% of this money was new money. Money that we did not have in our budget before, money that we did not take away from any other crisis, but money that we got from our legislator, from the European Parliament and from the member states, simply because of the political importance of the Ukrainian crisis. So I can say with good conscience that on the European side, we started a major program for the victims of the Russian aggression, but at the same time, we had record levels of spending in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, and also, I think, in Afghanistan. So in other words, one does not necessarily, so to say, exclude the other. It's not necessarily a zero-sum game. I also state that with the crisis in Ukraine, we get new donors. I mean, for example, take the Central and Eastern European member states of the European Union. I don't do them any harm if I say that traditionally countries like Poland or Estonia, Lithuania have not been among the foremost donors of humanitarian aid. Now they become very important donors, of course, with a focus on Ukraine and on Moldova. And by the way, not only the public sector, but also the private sector is very active in these countries. So I take this rather as good news, not only because there's more money and resources going into the sector, but I also believe that we can probably work with them in order to keep them interested and convinced of the need to fund humanitarian operations beyond Ukraine. Because there are other countries and other crises that are also relevant for them, where I think they could stay engaged in the future. Because once again, this is not only a funding decision by a government, this is also something which activates civil society. There are civil society organizations, NGOs in the Slovak Republic, in the Czech Republic, in the Baltic countries, in Poland, that get active now, and they were not active in the past on these issues. Let's maintain that. I also see that donors that you would not suspect, so to say, become active. For example, Saudi Arabia has now committed $100 million for humanitarian work in Ukraine. India is starting. So there is fresh money going into it. The question is, however, can this be sustained? I have so far been speaking about funding decisions last year. The question is, what happens this year? What happens next year? Because unfortunately, once again, this Ukraine war is promising, if I can use that term, to be a protracted crisis, another protracted crisis. And over time, of course, this will eat up more resources. So in other words, yes, I think both sides are right. Not in the past, no money has been kind of estranged from other crises, but in the future, the reserves are empty. And at the same time, the minister is right and Sofía is right, the operations have become much more costly. Inflation, the lack of foodstuff, the lack of fertilizers, everything becomes more costly. And I think in the food sector, we see this perhaps clearer than anywhere else, because very often food insecurity is not due to the lack of food, as we see in Yemen, for example. It's more due to the cost of food. When you go to Sana'a, you see lots of food there. You see flourishing markets, but you have many, many people who cannot simply not afford buying the food there. So it's not only a question of whether there is food, but it's basically a question of purchasing power and the distribution of that. So, that is, I think, the challenge that we are going to face. I'm very happy that if I look at the donor community and look back to last year, I think it took only about 2 months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine for donors to discover that this is not a local crisis, but a global crisis. Here in Brussels, if we had this call in February last year, I would have told you, yes, the focus is now very much on Ukraine. and I'm struggling to keep our political leaders interested in other crises around the world. But in April, already 2 months later, we made the first financial allocations available for food assistance and food security aid around the world. So it took about 2 months for leaders to comprehend that this crisis has a global impact and that we need to make money available. And for example, my department got about 600 million euros extra last year only to address food insecurity around the globe, with a focus on actually sub-Saharan Africa and Yemen. The question is, can that be maintained? Can that be sustained? Because we see rising food insecurity already for a couple of years. It started back in 2019. COVID already had a very negative effect on food prices and availability of food around the globe, and the Ukraine crisis added to that. So while this is the case, unfortunately, the funds are running a bit dry. And why is that so? And there, South Sudan is a very good example. The minister spoke very articulately about the humanitarian needs and the lack of funding. But I think one thing has to be added to that. If you look at South Sudan, it's a very good example. You see how scarce the donor base is. 80%, 90% of all humanitarian funding in South Sudan comes from the United States. About 10% comes from the European Union. And all the rest, the remaining 5 to 10%, comes from all the other donors together. So in a situation where, for example, the United States has to cut into its funding, the contribution of all the other donors together is simply not large enough to offset that cut. And that is a situation that you have in many countries. Yemen, there you have a little bit more balance in the donor base, but still, it is true that in the world, there are 3 major donors: the United States, the European Union, and Germany. They represent 67% of all ODA that goes into the humanitarian sector. And if any of them has a budgetary problem, then the entire world suffers. So the question is really, how can we get other donors to do more? And how can we get countries that so far have not developed a donor profile, although they are industrialized nations, they are wealthy nations, how can we get them more interested in humanitarian work? There are countries, for example, that are sizable donors of development aid, but do not give humanitarian aid. Can that be addressed, for example? Or there are countries that have a leadership role in a certain region, but don't provide humanitarian assistance for the countries and for the crisis in their own region. Can we have a dialogue on that? I'm afraid that it's not only about Ukraine, although it plays a role, it's about the entire financing structure of the humanitarian sector that simply is not fit for the challenges that we are going to see in the coming years.
Thank you very much for that. We have some questions addressing some of those points coming up as well in the conversation, and it's also really interesting to hear you, talk about how you don't think that there has been this sort of detracting effect of funding. It's been more an additional effect of funding, and there seems to be a little bit of a tension there with what Minister Atak was talking about, having donors specifically cite Ukraine. And that's also come up in some of our reporting at the New Humanitarian, anecdotally, and hearing these stories about certain programs in different countries not being funded, and donors specifically citing Ukraine for that. So it'll be interesting to see the numbers when they do come out, what story those tell. I'd also just like to remind the audience that the Q&A box is open. So if you have any questions for the panelists as we're moving along here, please feel free to pop those into the Q&A. And also, if any of the panelists would like to respond to each other during this conversation, just raise your hand, and we can bring you in to respond to specific points that others have made. And for now, I'd like to move on to Steve O'Malley, the UN OCHA's Deputy Director covering Eastern and Southern Africa, who was previously OCHA's head of office in South Sudan. Earlier this year, the UN appealed for $51.5 billion to help 230 million people in need, the vast majority of whom do not live in or around Ukraine. Steve, we've heard today about some of the needs in Yemen and South Sudan, and the head of UN OCHA, Martin Griffiths, has previously said needs around the world are shockingly high, and that they are so high, at least in part because of attention on COVID, Ukraine, climate, etc. I'm trying to understand the fundamental dynamic here. Is the issue that there isn't enough funding available to address the multitude of global crises at the moment, or is it more of a question of how funding is distributed and the politics of what crises are in the spotlight at a given time?
You can hear me all right? Great. At first, apologies because I was a little late in joining the call today, and the reason I was a little late is that we had convened a meeting of all of the resident humanitarian coordinators in and around Sudan to talk about what we could do both to address the influx of people, the movement of people out of Sudan, but also how we can assist inside Sudan as well. So, you know, there is a real, I think, a manifestation there, and I just kind of highlight to everybody, part of that discussion was also working jointly with UNHCR to put out our appeals together next week. So, I want to use that as a very real-time example of trying to give crises their appropriate attention. Similarly, if you look at that set of both Sudan and the countries that neighbor Sudan, many of them have a humanitarian appeal of some kind. Many of those appeals indeed are underfunded at this point in time, as the minister very clearly articulated. So maybe to go back a bit to your question, to be honest, I think there's is the problem that is there enough money? I guess the question is in what context, right? Is there enough money given other things that member states spend their budgets on, et cetera? So, I think that's in some ways the money can be made available as necessary, but those are, that's a political decision that individual member states make as to how they set their budgets. Using what we have, I would, go back to the comments that Michael Koehler had made. At least the evidence that we have from an OCHA side as well, and it isn't, I wouldn't call it completely conclusive, but it is clear that a number of the traditional donors, quote unquote, the OECD member states, did come up with new money for Ukraine. That we have seen an increase in 2022 in that budget, and it appears that that is primarily new money. What we are trying to do is definitely keep the attention on these different crises. And I would also say, if I look at the way that Martin Griffiths spends his time, he's just been in Jeddah for the last couple of days working on the Sudan crisis. He was previously in Port Sudan, et cetera, et cetera. So, and now he's in Istanbul working on the grain initiative to keep as was said earlier, the flow of grain and fertilizer as well flowing out of Ukraine and Russia to keep global food prices down. So, I think there is, a shared effort by all of us on this call to keep that attention where it's needed. I think, what for me is really sobering is to look at the way that needs have changed. And even if we go back to 2015, the number of people in need, if we go back to the numbers of people in need, we have seen the number of people in need go up by 350% since 2015. We have seen the global appeal requirements raised by about 170% over that point in time. We've seen actually funding go up by relatively the same amount, but when you have a small number going up and a big number going up, you're going to get a bigger and bigger gap between the two of them, even if the rate is the same. So and there are obviously a number of factors there. I would also like to also raise a couple of other connected issues, if I could here, where we're also not seeing development spending rise at the level we would want to see either. We see, for example, a 100% increase, if I'm correct, in the amount of so-called development spending that went for refugees in refugee assistance in country, from OECD members as well. So, there is a set of challenges that we are having to, in fact, generate sufficient resources. And this is, I'd also go on to the issues around climate change here and climate change financing, where it's very clear climate change financing is not going in sufficient amounts to the countries most vulnerable, the poorest countries that are most vulnerable. So, I mean, those are all facts in a certain way. And what we're trying to do is like, how do we collectively keep the attention on all these crises at the same time? They are all very real crises, and so how do we collectively do that? I'm actually optimistic in the sense that we can try to do that. I think there's a collective willingness to do it, in spite of the fact that certain things are going to be more prominent at certain times, certain days, certain weeks. So I know that might not be a totally satisfactory answer, but I think that has to be our orientation.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Steve. And I want to direct the conversation a little bit. We've been talking about these sort of some high level, sort of global level questions around funding. I want to direct the conversation back towards sort of the local contexts and specifically local actors and how local actors sort of fit into this bigger picture. So we keep hearing about the importance of listening to the needs of people affected by humanitarian crises. So Michael, if I could turn to you, I wonder if the EU is giving more funding to local actors, and how do you approach that? What successes have you seen, and what barriers have you encountered to doing that?
Yeah, localization is probably the area or the individual item of the grand bargain commitments that has made least progress over the past 10 years. But I think it's very high on the agenda right now, and everybody speaks about it. Everybody is very much in favor. I hope this is not just lip service, but I'm pretty sure it is not only lip service. Since I think we all do not only agree about the competence about local organizations, local NGOs, but also the fact that the humanitarian sector has to evolve. We can simply not continue the same business model that we had over the past 30, 40 years as an organization or a sector that mobilizes help with money from the north and with personnel and organization from the north and intervenes in the south. This simply is not good enough. And it's not necessary any longer. So localization plays an important role, and every donor has its own guidelines, rules, approaches, which of course depend on the legal basis and on the set of finance that you have. In our case, we have only about 3 months ago published guidelines for localization that are binding for all ECHO partners. So if one of our established partners, be the UN agency or the Red Cross, Red Crescent, or one of the more than 160 NGOs that we are working, if they want to compete for EU funding in the future, they need to have very strong localization components in their proposal, meaning that at least 25% of the money will be implemented through local partners. But it's much more than that. Localization is not only subcontracting. It's establishing a partnership when it comes to needs assessments, when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to discussing strategy. And ultimately, of course, I believe that localization needs to come to a relationship where first local partners are implementing most of the assistance, but also local funding and south-to-south funding comes very much in addition to the funding that we have right now. But this is a long process. The problem with localization is that I think at this moment in time, there's very strong consensus that we should do it, but frankly, nobody wants to change the entire system. For example, a typical reaction that we get when we speak with our partners about localization is that they say, yes, very good, we want this, but of course, then you need to give us more money, because we need to keep the same amount of money that keeps our operations running, but at the same time, we need to have additional money that goes through to local partners. Now, I'm reducing the debate a little bit unduly here, but of course, if you take that seriously, it means that in future, you would do the same amount of work for a higher cost. That cannot be, so to say, the right way to do localization. I'm sometimes wondering, as somebody who has spent a lot of his life in development projects, where contracting local partners is a daily thing. You know, European development aid, for example, is able to finance local NGOs already since the early 1990s. In humanitarian aid, this is not the case. Legally, we, but also some of the other big donors, do not have either a system or even the legal possibility to contract, for example, Mohanna's NGO in Yemen. We have to go through intermediaries to have, let's say, the right reports, the right feedback, the right financial monitoring systems, and so forth. But ultimately, I think we need to develop the system further. We need to come to a situation where in a couple of years, major donors, wherever they sit, be them in Brussels or in Washington or in Berlin or in Paris, can also contract a Yemeni or a South Sudanese NGOs directly. And then it becomes a question of the right choice of project. Is it for this or that project more appropriate to contract a local partner that has all the knowledge and all the presence of local partners, but maybe part of a power struggle, for example, that makes it more difficult for this local partner to be independent and impartial? Or is it more appropriate to go through an international NGO or, for example, a UN agency? So we need to have this choice, which at this moment in time we do not have. But every partner, every actor in the humanitarian sector is making real efforts, is undertaking real efforts to go more local. And what I can tell you is that when I am traveling, and I've been to South Sudan, to Mozambique, to Niger, to Yemen, to Ethiopia over the past months. So even in countries where, you know, the level of conflict is very high and the needs are really big, you find competent local organizations. I have not yet found a crisis theater where I would say, here, unfortunately, we cannot work with local partners. So that, I think, puts a lot of stress on us to go in the right direction. And I think the burden of proof for not going local is increasingly on the side of donors and implementing partners, because in reality, we can work through local organizations.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. Minister Atak, I'd like to turn to you on this next question, also about localization. In South Sudan, are you seeing funding reach local organizations? And what is sort of the status of international funding helping to empower local actors in South Sudan? Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much for that emphasis. For us in South Sudan, this is one of the major concerns when we talked about humanitarian assistances and the level of funding globally, and then compare to the final product in terms of services to our people. There has been a lot of debate on this, especially the local organization, national organization. They have been actually raising this, many times from local organization as well as even from the government by complaining that for the donors to implement all these projects through the third party, sometimes delay and reduce the final product or the final assistance that is needed to be delivered to the people. For instance, if we need food supply and the donor donates, for it to be done, it needs to go to a third party, and then third party will incur a lot of administrative costs that will, at the end of the day, reduces the supply that needed. This has been actually a topic of actually discussion, especially from the government side. And sometimes people go beyond that, saying that maybe the government will not do it sufficiently the way the donors want it. And it gives some suspicious around accountability of all this. But from the local NGOs and local partners, they have been actually raising this, that any funds that come to South Sudan, and you remember the figure that I was talking about, they have been raising a concern that these funds, they don't get anything on this. It means it is only the international NGOs that are actually implementing all this to our people. And the local people, the local organization are left without any responsibility about this, apart from what they do locally. So for us, we are looking at it as a concern that in this forum, if it is raised, I'm happy to share this with all of you, that it is something that in case of South Sudan need to be looked into. If, for instance, one person was saying that it needs to be organized or another system is put in place so that we make sure this happen smoothly. It is true that nobody is rejecting to employ a local partner. But at the end of the day, you get people complaining. So it needs a sort of coordination so that we make sure this thing happen the way it's supposed to give impact to what actually needed to be delivered. As a government, what we need, as I said, is that our people are actually in dire need. As I said, the level of displaced person because of the climate change is very big. And in South Sudan, we are not contributing into a global warming, yet we are actually facing the impact. So which need, it is not a level of government alone to do this, but it is also, we need the help from the international community that they continue supporting our people. Last 4 consecutive years, we have been witnessing this flooding. Our people have been displaced from their places that they were living and that they had the means of livelihood. And they are forced to go to where they have nothing totally, which, creating a lot of suffering to our people. And also, we are grateful for those who came and actually helped our people. But still, for us to have this effective help, we need also to involve our local organization, because these people knows the complexity of our culture, the complexity of our way of living. So that sort of information helps whoever is implementing any project to actually achieve optimum goals in this. So our experience tells that we lack this to some extent. And we are putting it across this forum that South Sudan need also that kind of extending this service to a local people that are actually ready to do it sufficiently, to do it in a way that it creates unemployment even for them, which reduces this suffering from even those who are actually doing this. Because if you take our population, because most of them are jobless, because most of them are having no experience, this is why the level of poverty is continuing to rise. But if we engage all this, it will also create another opportunity of job, instead of us concentrating on those NGOs that are capable, that we think they are capable. Of course, any donor would want to employ an NGO that is capable to do what anybody wants. But also for this contribution to have a good impact on the ground here, we need also to consider other aspects. Now in South Sudan, we have an NGO Act that permits any NGO, especially the international NGO, to employ at least 80% from its workers from the local. This, we wanted to actually encourage that localization. We want to encourage that localization so that we also build the capacity of our people indirectly while we are actually giving services to them. Because after a while, after some period, we will benefit from this. And then we have a healthy country that can stand alone and does not need all these huge humanitarian needs. Because now, as I said from the beginning, most of the population of South Sudan are needing this humanitarian assistance. And as a government, this is not our intention. It is because we have just emerged from some conflicts. We have just got our independence. This is why other aspects are not in place. But we want to move from this level of giving our people humanitarian assistance to a developmental assistance. This is what the government is intending. So we welcome any assistance for us to move from this level to another level that we will reduce this issue of poverty, and we will actually continue doing good thing to our people. So localization is one thing needed to be started so that we also do two things at a go, to help our people, to help people who are in need, and at the same time, train them, capacitate them so that later on they continue doing that. This is the example we have in South Sudan that we needed actually to draw attention of the international community and donors community plus the other NGOs to take care of that point.
Thank you very much, Minister Atak. That was a very insightful explanation of the need for progress on the localization agenda in South Sudan and its potential benefits. Mohanna, just briefly, I would also like to turn to you on the same question about the progress or lack thereof on the localization agenda in Yemen.
Well, a localization agenda in Yemen has been moving, but I'm not gonna say with the pace that we would like to see. Local organizations in the country has made some great advancement in the quality of delivery of the services, and they excelled in the participation approach between us and the communities. Also, usually the local partners are the first responders on the ground. We are always there in the front line, how to access areas. We know the dynamics of the conflict. We know the complexity of the social coherence within the community itself. So I believe that localization has always been in the agenda. However, it has not been reflected in the policies of the donors. And that's a big issue that needs to be addressed. There is no doubt there is some very strong local NGOs, not just in Yemen, Afghanistan, DRC, everywhere. However, what we have seen and what I have felt in meeting many donors and back donors, that usually they put all national NGOs within the same pot. And there is always the problem of trust that we have to prove, we have to go through this due diligence, and yet we have to convince them again that we are able to implement those projects. I do not know how complex is it, their process in adapting their policies towards more localized approach, but it's a step that needs to be done. If not today, it needs to be done tomorrow. That's regarding their policies. Also, as a local partners, what makes our life a little bit difficult in advocating is the access in many countries, we have access issues internally to reach to those most affected and those most in need. However, there is another access issues that I need to break out here, that we cannot go outside our countries, for example, to Europe or to the United States to advocate, especially the media is not doing a good job in that. Another constraint is financial constraints. We know with the deterioration of funding, we try to get funding directly, which is much more efficient and effective to implement our projects here in Yemen. However, what we have seen that there is a financial constraints that we cannot talk to donors, and if we could, we cannot ask, for example, to donate directly to the affected populations. And this is also another issue that need to be tackled. We have been trying to make our interventions more efficient, more collaborations, more partnerships is being done. Also, we are having some collaborative efforts towards advocating for our crises, not just as I mentioned in Yemen, but also other crises as well. We knocked the latest technology doors such as cryptocurrencies funding and all this kind of fundings, but yet sometimes we manage to succeed, sometimes we don't, and we just keep knocking on those doors until we find some answers to the questions that hurdling our work on the ground. So with this panel, I hope that we can get some answers on how, as a local partners, we can accelerate the process of adapting their policies for the correct localization approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohanna. And we have about 20 minutes left, so I would just like to ask the panelists to keep responses to the questions from here on out a bit brief, maybe one to 2 minutes, so we can get through as much of the conversation as possible. And staying on the topic of localization here, you know, the amount of funding available in Ukraine going to local actors has also been an issue. So it's not just in other crises around the world, but it's also in Ukraine, where we've been talking about sort of this preponderance of funding being sent anyway. One of our readers, Charles Tenay, sent a comment to point out that there are hundreds of volunteers and organizations, both international and Ukrainian, looking for funds in Ukraine, yet compliance requirements and other issues similar to the ones that Mohanna was just speaking about in Yemen are making it difficult for a lot of groups doing frontline work to obtain that funding. How are you addressing that in the work that CARE does, Sofía?
No, thank you. That's a really important question. And in fact, as when you introduced me, you said that I've been quite frustrated about the very slow change in humanitarian in our humanitarian community, precisely in regard to this issue. Michael, you mentioned sub-grant agreements. That has been a lot of our language in Ukraine and beyond when we support local partners, and precisely it's about moving away from that, because you know, that is a language that actually perpetuates unequal power relationships between international NGOs, local NGOs, donors. And it is about, like Mohanna said, really focusing on trust and developing ways that we can strengthen our relationships and what we all have to offer in order to have a significant response at scale. Because that's why I also mentioned locally led and local partners in my when we talked about the media, because the spotlight also needs to be on that, because that's the reality of our work. Like Steve, I have not been in any country where there have not been very capable local partners that actually can do magnificent humanitarian response. Now, what I would say, just concretely to the question, is that what we do as an international NGO may have to change. Because in order to support those local partners in Ukraine, in Yemen, in South Sudan, often international NGOs and the humanitarian sector, we send also our experts, we work with our local international NGO teams that have expertise in technical areas like shelter and wash, but more and more that capacity exists. And what we actually need to do is to simplify procedures for, instead of due diligence, mutual due diligence processes. Instead of risk management, shared risk management. Instead of compliance, collaborative compliance, where we do this actually together, and very intentional learning. So please notice here the language of reciprocity with local partners, which to me, this is where the crux of the issue. It is not about the international community kind of looking at local partners. Are they doing well or not? Do we need to put even, additional measures to ensure their compliance? It's about doing this together and doing this in a collaborative way. And that's where, we need to look at our procedures and simplify them massively. And the other thing that local partners are asking for is multi-year flexible funding, because often in the humanitarian cycle is a very short-term funding, and one funding cycle is over, there may be a gap until the next one. Local NGOs may not have the resources or the reserves in order to have that gap of 2 months before new funding starts. So the ability to strengthen them with multi-year flexible funding is also, I think, something that it's on our end to work on that much more collaboratively. So I just wanted to, put out the issue of trust, of partnership and true collaboration, not just waiting for reports, but actually together working on compliance and risk management. And if I may add one more point, I know you want us to be brief, and this is my last point because this has come up already quite a few times from all of you, which is how do we also connect this locally with local NGOs with development funding? Because I do believe that any humanitarian crisis is in a way a failure of development. It really is. So how can we strengthen, in times of peace, in times of stability, those local partners, so when the time comes of a humanitarian response, they can already work from a position of strength. And that's the onus is on us to figure that out in a much better way, because we work so much in silos in the international community, while that is not true for local partners. In fact, I think the true partnership is actually, the response to the famous nexus, because partners don't think in that way and bring all of that together. It's us often from the international community that have created kind of these very separate streams. And so locally led and partnership is our best response for more relevant work, no matter whether from a development or humanitarian response angle.
Thank you very much for that, Sofía. Now I'm gonna turn to our first audience question from Marina, and she is asking, what is your analysis to the panelists in general? So if anybody wants to take on this question, please raise your hand or just jump in. What is your analysis of why humanitarian needs globally increased? Do we have a meta-level study and analysis of this? Is our definition of what constitutes humanitarian needs still the same? For example, we did not include resilience in humanitarian response plans formally, but now we do. Does anybody want to speak to that? Yeah, Mohanna?
Yes, I would like to say that there is many reasons why the requirements of funding has been increasing in the past years. For example, the number of conflicts has drastically increased since 2005, 2010 until now. We have seen the number of crises in the past 2 years maybe exceed the number of crises in the whole 90s. That's one of the reasons. The second one is I want to mention here that the inflation rates and also the need of more comprehensive interventions has also shed its light on the requirements of fundings. I remember in like 2005, 2006, 2008, the main requirement was, for example, in shelter and food. However, we are now seeing the requirements expanded to education sector, to other sector, more emphasis on protection, which is very much required, and in addition to the other sectors as well. Finally, the quality of data collected in the field sites has been improving, and the lessons learned from crisis to another has helped us to have more accurate data. More accurate data simply means in humanitarian, more numbers. That's one of the reasons of the increased requirements of funding in the past years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohanna. Michael, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think Mohanna is spot on. I totally agree with everything he said. But, you know, if you speak with the old hands, they would tell you that 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have this level of protractedness in humanitarian situations. Was it because we didn't have the data? Was it because humanitarian activity was more triggered by natural disasters? When you get in quicker, but you're also out relatively quick after the disaster strikes. Today, we are in some countries, in some situations, for 40, 50 years. In many crises for at least 20 years. And there I would like to join what Sofía said. Very often, humanitarians implicitly take over tasks that are not theirs. They are tasked either by governments who are not there, or by development actors who are increasingly no longer there. And that leads, of course, to a prolongation of what we do, but also to the fact that in reality, we have no more exit strategies. So every year, we have additional conflicts that come, like now in Sudan, but the old conflicts don't go away. And that, of course, puts a huge pressure on the budgets. Climate change now is still adding to that. But this is only the latest game in town. Back to you.
Thank you, Michael. Now, I want to turn to a section of the conversation about how media attention sort of affects the issues that we've been talking about. At the New Humanitarian, we cover stories about humanitarian crises. It's our beat, it's our niche, but we're often competing with mainstream media outlets for attention, especially when it comes to engaging more general audiences. Mr. Atak, you're obviously very busy at the moment, dealing not only with the situation in South Sudan, but also with the fallout of the conflict in Sudan. How do you feel about the way that the situation in South Sudan is portrayed by the international media? You're on mute.
Sorry. This is very, very important question, especially in our side, because we always hear a bad side being portrayed about South Sudan. This is what we have been actually witnessing as the government, at least, not from the point of view of individuals, but as the government, we always bad side of what we do is being portrayed by the international media. Now in this crisis, we also observe that the only suffering of the people, when people are actually seeing these families, women, children, elderly people are moving and are suffering, is the only thing that is being portrayed by the international media. But at the same time, are not reflecting what the government is doing. As I said, somebody who is responsible about this file in the government, we have done a lot, but sometimes you don't see it in the international media. For instance, this conflict of Sudan, the international media have been actually reflecting the fleeing of these people from Sudan to the other countries, some going to Saudi Arabia, some going to Egypt, but they are not reflecting what is coming to South Sudan, which is very huge, because as I said, up to now, what we have recorded is more than 50,000 that have come to South Sudan. And of course, as the international community, we are much concerned about their livelihood, because people are running from the war, definitely they will have a lot that they are actually missing. So they need a support. This from South Sudan. And the other nationalities also are coming to South Sudan, either to flee from South Sudan to their countries or to stay in South Sudan. You remember in South Sudan, we host a lot of people from neighboring countries and other countries that are here. So they have fled conflict to South Sudan. This is not being betrayed. It means, in other way, people are actually underestimating the efforts the government is doing to respond to this need, and they are actually doing portraying. I mean, the other efforts the other country are doing, and I don't know what does it mean. Does it mean that these people are doing more than what we are doing? And if there is any support globally, just go to them without coming to South Sudan, or what is it? We don't know. But at the same time, you only see that bad story, and that the government of South Sudan is not doing enough. As the government, we are really suffering from this, and it is good, forum for me to put this forward, that the international media have to collaborate with the government of South Sudan, so that they are also portraying what the government is doing. In this also context, what the local government, local partners or local organizations are doing without any costs are also not being reflected. And we have a lot of people here, local organizations are doing their best. Individuals from South Sudan are also contributing to responding to the humanitarian needs that is being, impacted by the conflict in Sudan. Before, we had a lot of conflict. We have a lot of humanitarian crisis that always the efforts being done internally is not being portrayed. So it is good that to highlight this. And we have been actually putting forward to this international media here. And we always tell them that is what you are doing is not correct. You need also to balance your stories so that the other part of the world also get it right. Now, some of you have been actually told about stories that some of you may not be able to come to South Sudan about the conflict. You remember when we had the conflict, the stories that are being portrayed are actually frightening everybody to come to South Sudan. But when anybody comes to South Sudan, they come and see the reality on their own eyes. They wonder, and they don't believe that this is the reality in South Sudan. The Juba have been portrayed that is a dangerous city, is a city that you cannot just move freely. This is what has been actually said in international media. But when everybody come here, they get it different. So we are calling upon the international media so that they do their job fairly to the government of South Sudan and the people of South Sudan.
Thank you, Minister Atak, for that. And we are close to running out of time. I apologize to everyone for running slightly over here, but if we could just take 5 or 6 more minutes, I'd like to turn to all of the panelists for closing thoughts. And I'd ask all of you to keep your responses to 1 minute sharp, and I might be a little bit strict in terms of enforcing that also, so we can make sure everyone's voices are heard and we don't go too far over the time that we've allotted here. So we've spoken a lot about the current situation and how we got here, but I wonder where do we go from here? This we're sort of turning towards the 22% who from the poll in the beginning who saw some reason for cautious optimism. Steve, the UN has multiple appeals for billions of dollars to support millions of people. Some people feel the situation is quite bleak at the moment. Others say there's signs for hope. Do you see signs for hope? And what do you think the year ahead might look like? Again, briefly, about 1 minute.
I think very briefly, this year I think will be okay funding-wise from the indication. Okay, not great, but okay funding-wise from the indications that we've seen. I think what we are consistently hearing from donors is that 2024 looks like it will be a more difficult year. So if we start to look forward, that would be my concern. Yeah, thanks. Very succinctly.
Very succinctly, thank you. So Sofía, same question for you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for all of this conversation. By the way, and thank you, Eric, for the facilitation. I think a lot has been said. I guess one thing I want to stress in that we all are co-responsible for, and the minister also stressed this: the stories we tell, and that the outlook for all of us must be to tell those stories of local leadership, but honestly, the incredible heroism, resilience, courage, strength of people affected by crisis that we witness every day. If we stick to that story, if we tell that story in this very negative news cycle of how affected people are often the first responders, women-led organizations, in Sudan right now, colleagues are telling us about how local Sudanese are organizing themselves in community groups to protect their homes and shops from looters. I think this is really where we need to put our focus going forward and further incentivize that kind of response can thrive. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to join.
Thank you, Sofía. Minister Atak, back to you. Do you see any signs of hope in South Sudan for the year ahead, and how are you feeling about the year ahead?
Of course, we must be hopeful. We must hope that thing will go to a right direction, and what we do is to double our efforts and to change the way we have been actually conducting ourselves in giving services, in mobilizing whatever efforts. This is what is only needed. But if we continue the same level, and we can see now the crises are actually happening now and then we will be behind. So what we need is to change the way we have been doing things so that we go to the better. Because now everything is clearer now. What is needed is clearer. The nature is clearer. The funds is needed is also clearer. So what we need is the way we do it best. So adapting that, I'm really hopeful that thing will go to a good situation, especially in South Sudan, that we always expect a crisis. I am also hopeful that with the more efforts we are doing with our international partners, I think we will be in position to overcome all these crises. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Atak. Michael, same question for you from a global perspective. What are you expecting for the year ahead, and any signs of hope?
Well, I think there are signs of hope in as much as we have all good intentions. We want to do better. We want to be more local. We want to be more anticipatory. But I'm afraid all this is not good enough. The challenges that the humanitarian sector stands before are daunting. If we just take climate change, there will be so many more people, unfortunately, that will be either affected directly by natural disasters that are a result of climate change, or whose resource bases will be jeopardized because of climate change. That I believe that the humanitarian sector must really question the way how it operates. There is no time for simply muddling through. I agree with Steve that next year is going to be more difficult, but we don't need to simply somehow survive next year and then it's going to go better. Therefore, I say muddling through is not the right answer. I think we have to reflect more about how we can end the problems that we are working on. We are concentrating our efforts on making people survive in crisis situations, which is absolutely necessary. But do we reflect enough on how we could improve a situation so that's no longer necessary? I was struck when I was in the northern parts of South Sudan in Unity State, and when I asked people, ordinary people in IDP camps, but also the local authorities, what they need most, they didn't say more food or more money or more humanitarian operators. They said, we need somebody to build us a road. Because if you build a road, you can bring agricultural products to a market. You bring in food supplies at lower cost. You can resettle people who can no longer live where they are right now. So we're all concentrating on supplying aid to people who are there where they are, but we are not financing the road that would open them opportunities, economic and personal opportunities. Things like that, I think we should ask. And then the other thing is,
Michael. Sorry, I'm gonna have to cut you there just to avoid going too much further over time. Mohanna, could you very briefly answer the same question? Any signs for hope, and what are you expecting in the year ahead for Yemen?
Yes, there is always a signs for hope for Yemen and everywhere else. Wherever there is a challenges, there is an opportunities. However, we have to think thoroughly about our approaches, about the good things we have done, about the mistakes we have done. We are in need to break the silos between different sectors in a higher level. We are in dire need for a good anticipatory and risk management approaches. We are working towards a better and much more coherent localization strategy in the country. So I believe that we are coming to a better year, inshallah. And there is a question I want to briefly touch here within my own 1 minute. Someone talking about DRC and the dire situation there. Yes, DRC are suffering. In the latest NRC reports for the most neglected crisis, DRC was #1 for 2 consecutive years, and that is not a good ranking. And there is at least 27 million Congolese going hungry every day. And this is a crisis that everyone should have a spotlight on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohanna, for that. And with that, we're going to close this conversation. I apologize for going over time. There were also a couple of questions that we weren't able to get to. As always, there's more to unpack in these conversations, and I think among the many things that this conversation highlighted was the importance of engaging the public and public opinion, and the question of who should take the lead on reforming the humanitarian system was also a big one, and one that I think we could probably have a whole nother webinar on at some point to talk about as well. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers. Thank you to the audience who has been here throughout. Thank you to the New Humanitarians members and donors for their continued support. And please keep reading the New Humanitarian, subscribe to our newsletters, follow us on Twitter, and thank you all, and we'll see you at our next event.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you
Goodbye.
very much. Thank you very much
Thank
to
you.
everyone. Thank you, the host.